broken hearts, healing broken bodies. Make a way where there seems to be. Love and strength each new day. He will make a way. He will make a way. He will. He will make a way for you.
You were crucified and laid behind the stone. You lived and died, rejected and alone, like a rose trampled on the ground. You took the fall and thought of me above all.
We might need to change the mic.
Of all kings, above all nature and all created things, above all wisdom and all the ways of man. You were here before the world began. Above all kingdoms,
I left this one.
all thrones, above all wonders, the world has ever.
We are on page 26. Quite a bit of ground to cover, looking at the final journey. His death and the aftermath. So Livingstone is now back in England, disgraced, embarrassed, writes a book about his previous trip, but it doesn't really make much of an impact. No one is really interested. No one is really listening. Of course, he highlights in that book the evils of the slave trade. But again, because nobody's really buying the book or following, that just gets swept under the rug. No one is listening. He was still eager, though, to make a last attempt to get back to Africa. His goal was simple: make a discovery that would again put him on the map, that will make him reclaim a place of prominence, so that when he spoke about the slave trade, people would listen. And an opportunity arose in 1864 while he was in England. He read in the newspaper that there was a dispute between two explorers about the source of the river Nile. John Hanning Speke said it was in Lake Victoria. Richard Francis Burton said it was Lake Tana in the Egyptian island. By the way, both were correct. The Nile is fed from both of these locations. There's the Blue Nile and what's the other one? I think it's called the White Nile. That feeds into the Nile. And it flows again out of this highland in the interior of Africa down to Egypt, to Cairo. So, reading this dispute and the need for someone to go and find the source of the river Nile, David said, aha. Livingstone said, this is my opportunity. And so he made his interest known to the Geographical Society that he was ready to go on an expedition to find the source of the Nile. They agreed, and they sponsored him to go on that trip. He dropped his daughter Agnes in France, where she could attend school, and proceeded. He arrived in Zanzibar, further north than where he had been before, at the Ravuma, and we have a map of that last expedition. You can see from the map that there was not much he was able to do. This was the shortest trip in time in terms of distance. His time was really centered around northern Zambia there, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Mweru, and he finally died near the Chitambo there. That's at the bottom of that of those steps, Lake Bangweulu. In fact, it was in the Bangweulu swamps. The plains flood in the rainy season, and that's the Bangweulu swamps where he finally died. But he arrived in Zanzibar and befriended the Sultan. You know, it was run by Arabs. And there, he had not been there, but he now discovered that actually all those slaves that were being taken in the interior were actually being routed through Zanzibar. And so Zanzibar was really the slave market. And they had these slave pits where they would throw the chained slaves in there, and people would bid and buy those slaves. So the slaves were imprisoned in the slave pits of Stone Town. Now, Livingstone found it very difficult. He did not have money. He did not have much in terms of resources. He was basically moving blind in that region. That region was new to him, the northern part of Zambia. And now guess who knew the region? Guess who knew how to get around, who knew the tribes? It was the Arabs. Because the Arabs would come in, get slaves, take them to Zanzibar. And so it was a catch-22. He needs the Arabs, but he hates the fact that they're involved in slave trade. But he had no choice. And so he actually was dependent on the very people to show him around, the very people who were involved in the very thing he hated and wanted to put an end to. They did not want to kill him, but they knew he was the famous David Livingstone. His fame was still around him. And so their plan then was to just keep him moving around that part until he would finally die of natural causes. For years, people were wondering, where is David Livingstone, as he was there in that part of Africa? And so many reports were being sent out falsely that he had died. But none was, the conflicting nature of the reports showed people that he may still be alive in those internal parts. The Sultan gave him some men with whom to get into the interior. These were not like the tribes in the interior that were committed to him. These just wanted quick money out of him. So as soon as he was in the interior, they actually stole his supplies and quickly went back to Zanzibar and asked the officials there, the government officials there, to pay them, and said, look, David Livingstone has died, and now we want our pay because we're asked to accompany him. And so he was quickly abandoned by his guides and his servants who he had been given, and he was only left with a few faithful men. He circled around that area, the southern end of Nyasa, and then west to Bangweulu, Mweru, Tanganyika, where he set up his base in a place called Ujiji, a non-Arab slave route. He kept moving around from that base. He would make trips looking for places where he thought the source of the Nile could be. Of course, he was nowhere near to the source of the Nile. With so little resources, the key thing there was medicine for malaria, and he was really lacking in resources for that. And so he was just weakening and getting more and more sick. At one point, he was so desperate and hungry that he accepted porridge from a woman who had made it with her leprous hands. You know, they ate with hands, as we are still doing. That's where this whole hands thing comes from. And so he ate because he said, look, it's better than dying. I would rather eat this. So he was completely vulnerable, at their mercy. He traveled as an unthreatening person, very brave, but was just bouncing from place to place. For 4 years, no one heard of him. He was basically stranded in that region. And the slave traders opted to just mislead him and misdirect him the whole time so that he was lost among them. Various people were sent on expeditions in search of Livingstone, but none were able to find him. And now we come to the massacre at Nyangwe in 1871, just 3 years before his death. Livingstone recorded this terrible occurrence in his journals. Nyangwe was a market where various goods were sold, and upwards of 1,000 people, 1,000 to 2,000 people would come into the marketplace, trade, and there would be bartering and, trying to agree on prices. And David Livingstone was always amused by how they would try to get the lowest price or the best price. And to his great shock, in fact, he describes it here in this bulletin. Nyangwe was a big marketplace that he described as followed. The market was a busy scene. Everyone is dead earnest. Little time is lost for friendly greetings. Vendors of fish run about with potsherds full of snails or small fish. They sell cassava or exchange cassava, potatoes, vegetables, grain, bananas, flour, palm oil, salt, pepper. Each is intensely eager to barter food for relishes and make strong assertions as to the goodness or badness of everything. The sweat strands in beads on their faces. Cocks crow briskly, even when slung over the shoulder with their heads hanging down, and pigs squeal. The women carry huge loads on them. In fact, the primary people who are involved, like a usual marketplace in Africa, is women. So primarily it was women, children, and men who just come in, buy, and head out. A stranger in the market had 10 human under jawbones hanging by a string over his shoulder, human bones. On inquiry, David Livingstone asked him what that was all about, why he had the bones of human beings over his shoulder. He professed to have killed and eaten the people, the flesh off of those human bones, and showed his knife, explaining that it's the one he used to kill his victims. Livingstone expressed disgust. He and others laughed. On July 15, 1871, in a state of panic and shock, David Livingstone witnessed Arabs come into the market. In fact, he says, as he was leaving the market area, he saw these Arabs coming with guns. And at first he was wondering, why are they coming with guns? But then he thought, he didn't think much of it. And to his shock, he saw those Arabs open fire on the hundreds of people who were in the market and just started gunning them down. And the people began to run towards the river to get into canoes to escape. And even from that direction, other Arabs came up. So it was a planned assault on the market. Other Arabs who had not been seen came up and started gunning the people as they ran into the canoes and boats. He counted over 500 people, including women and children, who were killed. The purpose was this. The way the Arab slave trade worked is that the Arabs basically put pressure on tribes. It was the tribute system. So the Arabs, and the main currency was slaves. So the Arabs told the slaves, the tribes were going to come in periodically, have slaves ready for us. It was much easier than them going into the deep, African interior to pick up slaves. So they made the tribes battle it out. The tribe that lost, the winning tribe made sure they captured those who they had defeated and kept them chained and waited for the Arabs to come, and they would give up those slaves, and the Arabs would exchange the slaves for all sorts of resources and things. And when the tribes began to resist giving up the slaves or killing each other to hand over slaves, the Arabs would come and terrorize the tribes like this. And so they wanted to send a message by this assault on this Nyangwe market to say, look, we're not joking around. Don't think you can ignore us. Don't think we can come in here and you give us stories, you're not giving us slaves, we'll sort you out and we'll kill you. And so it was all meant to instill fear in the Africans so that they can comply by giving up slaves. Livingstone was obviously horrified, and he wrote about it in his journals, the horrific sights of that time at Nyangwe when people were attacked in that way. He ended up returning to Gigi on the shores of the Tanganyika and remained there. He was now quite weak, again resources dwindling, and salvation came in the form of a fellow called Stanley. Stanley was one of the many people who had been on the hunt to find David Livingstone. Whoever could find him and confirm he was alive, and whoever could even bring him out, because he was lost in Africa there for 5 years, 4 or 5 years. No one had heard from him. In fact, he would write letters and give them to the slave traders, but they would not deliver them. They would just go burn them, because they didn't want him to make contact with the outside world. Stanley had been hired by a very wealthy owner of a newspaper, an American. And he met him in a hotel in America. And Stanley was just a young man looking for fame and fortune. And he so happened to encounter this American media mogul. And this man said, look, can you find me Livingstone? I'm going to give you all the resources that you need, all the money you need, just find me Livingstone. And Stanley said, no problem, I'm up for it. And so with all the money that he had been given, he moved with a huge company of servants, and they were carrying all sorts of equipment and things, and he was well protected and covered for, well supplied, and he was moving with an American flag and dressed very nicely on a white horse, getting into Africa looking for Livingstone. It was at a village that he was shocked to be greeted in perfect English by one of the black men. Good morning, sir. Stanley turned to find a tall black man bowing to him at his side. The African, who was smiling broadly, wore a long white shirt and had a cloth turban around his head. Who the mischief are you? Asked Stanley. By the way, he was not kind at all to the Africans. This was a very brutal kind of no-nonsense guy. Who the mischief are you? Asked the white man. I am Susi. Now, Susi ended up being one of the few people who managed to get David Livingstone's body back to the coast after he died. So one of the faithful servants of Livingstone. He said, I am Susie, the servant of Dr. Livingstone. What? Dr. Livingstone is here? Yes, sir. In this village? Yes, sir. Are you sure? Sure, sir. Why? I left him just now. Good morning, sir, said another voice presently. Hello, responded the caravan leader. Is this another one? Yes, sir. Well, what is your name? My name is Chuma. That was the other companion of Livingstone. Is the doctor well? Not very well, sir. Where has he been so long? In Maniema. Now, you, Susie, the white man directed, meaning Stanley. Run and tell the doctor I am coming. Yes, sir, Susie responded. And off he ran like a madman. Meanwhile, Livingstone, from the veranda of his hut adjacent to the Ojiji marketplace, was observing the excitement caused by the sudden firing of guns. You know, Stanley would make an entrance because he's looking for Livingstone. At first, Livingstone was too surprised to believe that an Englishman was actually approaching. He had not seen an Englishman in 5 years. The English people were not there. It was just Arabs, Portuguese, and Africans. Susie came running at full speed. It is true, sir. It is a white man. He speaks English and he's got an American flag with him. More perplexed than ever by the news, the doctor asked, but are you sure of what you say? Have you seen him? When Livingstone asked Susie the traveler's name, then Susie realized he had not gotten his name. And finally, Stanley made his entrance into Ujiji and got down from his horse and approached this thin, white-haired, old-looking, tired man. And he said, David Livingstone, I presume, the famous statement. Stanley and Livingstone were together for 4 months at Ujiji. In fact, Livingstone, they became very great friends. Of course, Stanley gave him medication and food and supplies and helped Livingstone heal up and get restored in his health. And David Livingstone convinced Stanley to say, look, I've got a few places I suspect are the source of the Nile. Can we check them out? And Stanley said, no. Me, I've only got one mission here. I was given one mission. In fact, the mission was get David Livingstone dead or alive. Either bring him alive or bring his bones and his shoes and his clothes, but we need definite proof of whether he's alive or dead. And he said, that's my mission. I found you. I need to go. And David Livingstone prevailed on him to say, let's just check for this place. And since he was hoping to come back with David Livingstone and be the hero, he agreed to look at a few locations that did not prove to be the source of the Nile. And Stanley finally said, look, why don't we go out of this place? We can come back another time. Livingstone said, no. I have to end this terrible slave trade here. I have to do what I can. And so he gave Stanley the letters. Thankfully, he had kept copies of those letters that he was giving to the Arabs, knowing that most likely they were not being taken to their destination. He had also written many journals. And when he ran out of pages where to write, he started writing on newspapers. And so he gave all those to Stanley and said, take them. Go and inform England and the people there about the terrible slave trade that is going on here that I had no idea about until I came. I knew there was slave trade here, but not to this extent. And so they parted company, and Stanley left to go and report on what had happened. Livingstone continued moving around. Now he was by the Bangweulu swamps, April 1873, age 60. He was very weak again. The supplies had run low, and he ended up in Chitambo village. They had, one of the guys had run, a few of the guys had run ahead to prepare a hut for him where he would spend the night. Where by the time he arrived, by this time he couldn't even walk. He was being carried on a mat, through those swamps. And this is April, it was drizzling, it was raining, he had fever, he had diarrhea, he was bleeding, just so sick, and they knew that he would not make it very long. They finished the hut, put him inside. The chief Chitambo came to try and meet with him. David Livingstone was too sick. He said, "Come at another time when I feel a bit stronger." These were his final moments. I love this. He's almost even going in and out of consciousness. And while he's lying in his bed around 11 p.m., Susi is summoned by Livingstone. And he tells Susi these words. "Are men making that noise?" the doctor asked, "of the loud shouts that could be heard in the distance?" "No," Susi replied. I can hear from the cries that the people are scaring away a buffalo." A few minutes later, Livingstone asked slowly, showing that his mind was temporarily confused, "Is this the Luapula?" The Luapula flowed north out of the western side of the Bangolo, and the doctor had been anticipating approaching it. Susi informed him that they were in Chitambo's village. Livingstone was silent for a while, then queried him again, this time speaking in Swahili. "How many days is it to the Luapula?" "I think it's 3 days, master," Susi replied. Seconds later, as if in great pain, Livingstone half sighed and half said, "Oh dear, dear," then dozed off again. About an hour later, Susi, having returned to his hut, heard Majwara. Now, Majwara was the youngest from the team who had been stationed to sleep in the hut where David Livingstone was, because he was so sick they needed someone close by in case he needed something. Calling out, Majwara went, summoned Susi. "Bwana wants to see you." This time, Livingstone asked him to boil some water. Susi did it and soon returned with a copper kettle. Livingstone asked Susi to bring his medicine chest and hold the candle near him. Susi noticed that the doctor could hardly see. With great difficulty, Livingstone selected the medication, which he had Susi place by his side. After directing Susi to pour a little water into a cup and put another empty one by it, the doctor said in a low, feeble voice, "All right, you can go now." And those were the last words they ever heard him speak. Around 4 o'clock in the morning the next day, Susi again was called by the boy who was with Livingstone in the hut, Mjwara. He sounded frightened and said, "Come to Bwana, I'm afraid. I don't know if he's alive." Susi and Chuma ran into the hut, and they see in there Livingstone lying kneeling beside his bed as if in prayer. They instinctively almost walk back out for fear of disturbing him because he's praying. But then after observing him carefully, they notice he's not moving, which is what Mjwara had noticed as well. And so one of them, Matthew, goes quietly close, tries to touch him on the shoulder, no response. Touches him on the cheek and is cold. And he says he's cold. And they know that he is gone. And so they quickly lift him up, put him back on the bed. They go out of the hut to confer. What do we do next? And so they all agree that they should transport his body back to the coast. How far were they from the coast? 1,500 miles, not kilometers, miles. And it took them 9 months to get his body back to the coast. Some of them died in the process, but they felt it important to take his body back so that he's buried where he was born, in Britain. So what they did is they opened him up and got out his intestines, got out his heart, buried it at the base of a tree in the area. They did not want to alert the people in Chitambo village or anyone else that he had died, because they feared that they would be prevented from taking him to the coast. Carrying a dead body for 9 months to an African mind, they're going, this is witchcraft. What are you doing? Come on, bury this person. Thankfully, one of them had worked for a doctor, and so he knew how to embalm. And so using various ingredients, including brandy, they poured it in his mouth and in his body. And what they did is they dried him for about 10 days to 2 weeks. And what they did is they laid his body naked under the sun every day, and they just kept turning it, so that he would dry up, so that there would be no rot, no stink, as a way of embalming his body. Once they had done that, they bent in his legs at the knees, so that he wouldn't be so long, and so that it would look as though they're just, and they wrapped him up in this massive thing, so that it looked like they were just carrying fish or an animal or something. And they wrapped him up fully and began the trek, 9 months journey, 1,500 miles to the coast. When they arrived there, 6 dying along the way. Of the 12 of them, half of them died. There was even a point when they again encountered a village where they were being forced to pay tribute to pass and all this. So they went through a lot just to try and get his body to the coast. They finally managed, and it was held with the Catholics at Zanzibar, and eventually taken to England. When the body, and by the way, they sponsored Susi and Chuma, those 2 guys. One of David Livingstone's friends sponsored Chuma and Susi to travel, to follow the body later to England. And this is how we know all these details, because these guys were then, they handed over his last journals, and they were able to recount the last days of David Livingstone's life. In fact, there's a picture, if you Google it, Chuma and Susi, where they're sitting with people who are writing their accounts in England. When he arrived in England, when his body arrived in England, the question is, how do we confirm? Because you can't tell by looking. This is a man who had been dried in the sun for 2 weeks. So you can't tell by looking that it's David Livingstone anymore. It's just a dried human body. They guess what was used to identify him? The arm, the broken arm. So they looked and they saw that it was fractured at 2 points, that it had not set properly, it was dislocated, and that's how they confirmed that this is David Livingstone. You see how the Lord works. David Livingstone would never have guessed that this is the purpose for which God allowed me to be beaten by a lion. But it became so easy to identify and confirm that it was him. Livingstone's most successful expedition, this is the conclusion now. Livingstone's most successful expedition was when he knew least and had access to the least resources. What do I mean by that? His first expedition, when he knew nothing, he had nothing, was his most successful. The other 2, when he was famous, people even looking for him, were complete failures. He was desperate for another big discovery that would put his name on the map once again, so that he could use his voice, the voice that he would have, to expose again the ills of the slave trade, what he called the open sore of Africa. But he died, as far as he was concerned, having failed completely. Guess what God used? Actually, like I said before at the beginning, within a few months of his death, the slave trade in the east part of Africa was ended. How? When the English people heard that the body of David Livingstone had arrived, they said, how? How did it arrive? He died in the middle of Africa, 1,500 miles from the coast. They said his African companions are the ones that risked their lives. Some of them even died to get his body to the coast, and that's how we have David Livingstone's body. The English public was moved and greatly touched at the friendship, at the bond that Livingstone had with his servants, that they would risk their lives to get his body all the way to the coast. And so when the journals were published, again, bestseller. And guess what was written in those journals? The slave trade. Pages and pages and pages where David Livingstone had documented day-to-day abuses of the Africans by the Arab slave trade. And as a result, the Queen read to Parliament. At the opening of Parliament, she highlighted the slave trade that Livingstone had highlighted and challenged the English government, we have to do something about this. The Queen Victoria. And in that way, an entire ship, army ship, was sent from England to go to Zanzibar, where the Sultan ran affairs. And they put a contract in front of him, a treaty in front of him, and they said, sign or die. And it was a treaty to end the slave trade in that area, to continue using Zanzibar as a place to trade slaves. The Sultan signed it, and that marked a blow to the slave trade. And it never fully was able to recover. In other words, David Livingstone achieved by his death what he was trying to achieve by living. He thought what it would take is a big discovery. If I can just make another big discovery, then I'll have a voice and I'll convince them to intervene in the slave trade. Not so. All it took was him dying. In fact, what it took was his faithfulness to those men. The reason why the Africans loved David Livingstone so much is what we have said all along. It's that he was committed to them. He fulfilled his promises. He never abused them. He respected them and just treated them like human beings, something which they never experienced from any other kind of foreigner anywhere. And so it endeared them to him. It's because he didn't just hit them and insult them and abuse them that he had such a great testimony among them. And that's why they moved his body. In the end, what God used was not David Livingstone discovering some great thing. He just used his ordinary faithfulness to treat the Africans with love and respect. And that is what resonated in the hearts of the Englishmen. And that's what caused the Queen to say, send soldiers there and end the slave trade there. So God does not need us, I think, is the big lesson from the life of David Livingstone. God does not need us to be the greatest. I know we've talked about medals and accolades and awards for David Livingstone and how that played a major role in his ability to do so much. God actually doesn't need that, and he showed it in David Livingstone's life. He doesn't need his people to be greatly successful, to have a big name. God can use anything, anyone. All he needs are people who will be faithful, people who will put one leg in front of the other, people who will do the basic things well, who will seek to glorify him in the small ways. He doesn't need a big group. He doesn't need a mighty army. He just needs people to be faithful. And we can be shocked at how he will use even our small acts of faithfulness to his glory in ways that we could have never imagined. So David Livingstone died not knowing that what counted in the end was not the medals, was not the awards. It was his faithfulness to glorify God in his treatment of the Africans. And to this day, as we said at the beginning, he is still respected and loved. That different, the way he was so different from everybody else was passed on from generation to generation to generation. That there was once a man named David Livingstone who treated us in a way that no other ever did. And that's why even to this day is respected all over these parts where he walked. Interior of Zimbabwe, Botswana, Angola, Mozambique, and Zambia as well. All right. Any questions, comments, additions, subtractions from the life of David Livingstone? Mike is here. Yes, start with the back.
All right. Looking at the life of David Livingstone and everything you've highlighted, how did he manage the language barrier? Looking at him moving across east to west, south to north.
Yeah, basically the the tribes in the interior had intermingled, and there was some and there was overlap in the languages. So that was very helpful. But also when he encountered a new language, he committed to learn it. You can see as he's dying, he's now speaking Swahili. Wow, he's even dazed. He doesn't even know where he is, what's happening. The brain kicks into Swahili. So he really committed himself to learn. I mean, he studied the language. He produced dictionaries in the local languages, And so he was a man who committed to studying the language. From the time he got on the boat the first day, he was already compiling a dictionary, putting together a vocabulary of words and using it. And above all, he didn't spend time in the mission stations, right? He spent all his time with the Africans, with slaves, with Arabs, with tribes. And so he was just completely immersed with people where he was the only white person. And so he was forced, and even he said it. He said, by me being right in the middle of these people, I had no choice but to pick up the language and learn how to communicate. So that helped as well. But there was overlap in languages, and words were similar and things like that. Yeah. Yes.
Also, just wanted to add that, so he used to, he mentioned, that he used to make friends with the indigenous people. So wherever he went, he found friends that he made, but he also had his trusted friends like the sushi and everything. Sushi, sorry. Yeah, so they used to interpret for him. Like if he reached in a place, for example, when he arrived in, when he arrived in places where he didn't know, he used to have those indigenous people that he trusted. And most of the languages, like for example, in the northern, you find that there is Bemba, and then there is there's another language which is a dialect of Bemba. Yeah. So you find that if this person can understand Bemba, they can also understand the other language. Yeah, so he invested in friendships with the local people.
Good. Over here. Ladies first.
So I have a question in terms of David Livingstone's focus, especially when he came back from England.
Mm-hmm.
It seems, I haven't read his journals before, but it seems as though he was, as you mentioned, very fixated on finding the next big thing. We don't hear much. Pre-England, he was very much gospel-centered, and you could hear everything he was doing, gospel. Post that, we don't hear much of it. It seems like he was focused on discovering, finding, and even in his relationships with the locals, I don't know if it's in his journals, did he ever sit to continue that sort of
Practice.
practice of sharing the gospel, even as he's on his discovery, because you also see that he made friends with Stanley, who came, and Stanley doesn't sound very Christian.
No, it's not.
So I
Henry
don't.
Morton Stanley, yeah.
Yeah. So, and I mean, I don't know how. Yeah, it seems like the focus changed. The other part where we see the focus changed a bit was when he came back with the army. Well, we can call it what did we call it? The university.
University's mission.
Mission, yes. Before he went there with a pastor or with a missionary. This was now with people who have got papers and degrees, and he was good with that.
Yeah.
I guess because of the funding. But it seemed like the focus had changed. Is that true to say that he lost that touch, or it's just that we don't know enough about David Livingstone intimately to see if that was still there even while he was going on his journeys?
Yeah, good question. He made it a point not to travel on Sunday, and wherever he landed on Sunday, he would gather whoever was around and he would preach the gospel to them. So that was his thing. That was what he did throughout. And so in that sense, that never left. However, you are right that this thing of finding, the great whatever, became the main thing. In fact, the first Sunday when he arrived with the university's mission, I was surprised when I read how he asked for volunteers to work on Sunday, to say, can we continue assembling the sheep today even though it's Sunday? So when I read that, I was going, that's unlike you, David Livingstone. So I think he was just under all this pressure that the British government is depending on him and he has to get it done. So, it's almost like us when you're under pressure of work. It's like, hey, this has to happen. This needs to be done. So I think he did have quite a bit of that happening with him. But also he was certainly under great amounts of discouragement. His wife had died, especially by the third one. His wife had died. He was cut off from Europe, and the last thing he felt they knew of him was that he was a failure, and so he's just in a lot of, he's just a discouraged, depressed guy, and he's sick. So I think that played into it as well. So I think that's the power of the story, that in the end, God used his faithfulness in how he related to the people, as opposed to whatever big discovery he was after. Yes. Oh, there then the back.
Okay.
There then behind. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering. It is said here that he was buried next to Charles Darwin. I've known Charles Darwin to be an atheist. So, what's the relationship? Him being buried to maybe an atheist?
He wasn't an atheist.
Yeah.
Unless I'm mistaken. He just had a different, he came up with a different idea of how the world came to be, which was evolution.
Yeah.
But he was still in a very religious culture, Darwin. But he was still a prominent person. So where Livingstone was buried is for the prominent. In fact, he had a state funeral pretty much when his body returned. And he was buried in a very prominent place, almost like where do we bury presidents there? Something like that. Okay. So it's still there in England, and there are a lot of prominent people buried there. West Abbey. What they call it? Abbey. Westminster Abbey. Yeah, Westminster Abbey. So it just so happened, I guess, that the next space was available was next to Darwin. Okay. But apparently they even wrote letters to each other.
Is that so?
Yeah. So something to research there.
Okay.
Yeah. Just behind.
Thank you for the presentation and the learnings. Mine is just a comment springing from an experience, or at least something that I learned many years back through a sermon on missions. It's a sermon that actually Daniel and I listened to while we were on campus, because we were roommates. And that statement has always stuck with me, and it's the fact that I remember the preacher Oscar Muriu. That's the preacher, Kenyan.
I've heard of him.
Yeah. He mentioned or pointed out how that when we go into missions, usually what drives us there is a passion for the lost and a passion to spread the gospel and to reach the unreached. And we are determined, we are resolved, and we are not so bothered about the availability of resources and support and so on. We look to God for sustenance and strength, and he carries us through. But he points out that oftentimes we fall into the trap or the misconception that for us to have meaningful impact or a greater reach, what we need is more resources and more connections and more influence. If we could have that, we could then reach more and do more. But the opposite tends to happen when those resources come and when the influence comes. Because, and I think it's sort of what is seen in this story as well. As you pointed out, in his first journey, he had very little. He was not known. He really survived by God's grace, you know. And so many things were not in place, and yet he did so much. And my guess would also be that his level of dependency on God, when he didn't know what would happen tomorrow, what would happen in the next couple of months, was quite high. And then when things were in place, when all the resources were there, so much backing from government, equipment and whatnot, I'm sure it was all well planned out, strategic plans and whatnot. And yet things seem to just not pan out. And so I think for me, that's a very valuable lesson that we could also draw at individual or at church level, of that understanding or that assumption, and how that it's not correct. That for us to really have meaningful impact and a greater reach, we need more money, more resources, and more power, a bigger platform, you know, more connections to great people, you know, to speak for us or to put us on their platforms so that we could have greater influence, because oftentimes it tends to have the exact opposite. And oftentimes it makes us rely less on God and depend more now on those resources, the connections, the influence, and whatever equipment or gadgets that come our way. Thank you.
Yeah, Paul talks about it in 1st or 2nd Timothy when he tells the young pastor, warn the rich not to, how does he put it? Not to become haughty, meaning proud, and not to place their trust in their riches. That's what he says. And that's always the challenge, you know. You talk to churches today, why aren't you doing missions? Why can't you plant a church? Number one reason, we don't have money. We don't have money. We can't even pay our pastor. How can we start thinking? You know, so that's just the mind. When we have a building, when we have this number of members, then we'll... No, it doesn't work that way. God will take care of everything. John MacArthur put it well. He said, he said of his own ministry, I chose to focus on the depth of my ministry, and I left God to deal with the width of it, the breadth of it, like how far it goes. I just wanted it to be deep, grounded in the word, and that my job was done. What God does with it after that is really up to him. I think that's how it should be. At the back there, Mrs. Mwindula.
I was almost changing my mind.
Oh.
Yeah, I just wanted to find out, like, what would be your comment on how he treated his family, especially the children, you know?
That's a great question. Yeah, David, that was his biggest regret in life. That he, I mean, let's call it a spade a spade. He abandoned his family, right? He wasn't there for them. that first year in Africa, that first period in Africa when he married, that was really the time he had with his wife, you know. Once she went to England, they were pretty much apart from a few, like 2 years when he got back. And then now even when they travel together, she's apart from him, away from his kids. So he's criticized for that he abandoned his family for the sake of the gospel, you know. And it's something which pastors are told, it's really emphasized to us. You know, don't abandon your family for the sake of your family is your number one ministry and all these things. So the reality is it really troubled him. In fact, he wished that he had never married and never had children because he regretted not being there for them. I think maybe I should hear what you think. What do you think? Before I give you the authoritative position. Any thoughts on that? Do you think he was wrong in that regard to do that? He couldn't be with them in Africa. They were dying, literally, you know. They were over here. They were dying. Again, he had a job to do in Africa. He couldn't start going to be in England, you know. So does he abandon the mission? Go to England? Was he okay to abandon the family? Working? What do we do about that?
Yeah, I think he was wrong, but I think he was also pressured, like, by his mother-in-law. I don't know if it was the mother-in-law.
Mother-in-law,
yeah, who was saying, you know, how can you take your family there? You know, they are suffering, they're whatever. Just
in fact,
take
she
them
said,
back.
is the death of one child not enough? Imagine your mother-in-law telling you that. Are you not satisfied with one death? You want more?
Yeah.
Some tough words.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, I think he was wrong, but he was human as well, giving in to the pressure. And I think it's something that anybody could experience or face.
So would you say he should have abandoned the mission?
Well, he shouldn't have abandoned his family. I don't think so. I think he should have stayed with them.
So he should have abandoned us, the Africans. Because it can't be both.
Yeah, I guess it can't
Especially
be.
when he went, I mean, you can understand the first time when he says it will be 2 years, but then when he travels all the way to Luanda, and are you criticizing him there? Should he have traveled back to his family or spent another 4 years going now to the other side? Where are you on that one?
Okay, now I don't know.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No
Yeah,
judgment,
let's see
whatever
what
he
Daniel
chooses.
thinks there. But I just wanted to explain to you how the stakes are in this situation.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the session, learned so much. And I'm just amazed that he was such a great guy and he did so much for the kingdom, so much for the continent. And I think coming down to this issue on the family, I think we can see the failure. It's glaring. We see it. And I think it just reminds us that he was a man like all of us, capable of failing his family, capable of failing God. And I think he reminds us why Jesus is our ultimate example, that in all areas, Jesus sticks. And that's why he's our Savior. That's why he's our Lord and he's our example. So I think he points us to Christ, that even having succeeded so well in sharing the gospel, bringing the gospel to us, in making the interior open, that the ultimate example is through Christ. And in our quest for mission, career, family, we should still look to Jesus because he won't fail us like this great man did in that area. That's my comment.
All right, any other comments on this family issue? Mr. Tagoma, you have one? Oh, it's being forced on you.
I think it's a tough one because it was absolutely necessary, what he did.
Right. He wasn't playing games.
No, he wasn't.
He wasn't there for fun.
It was, you just look at what, the life he lived,
Yeah.
To even bring us to where we are. It was really, a lot of sacrifice. I have two, I'm looking at it in two ways. One, that probably he shouldn't have married. And secondly, I think the other aspect would be that, thinking of marriage, then he needed to find a wife who was actually in conformity with his ministry. To me, I think that is very important because she would have understood what was going on, and I think the damage wouldn't have been that bad.
Yeah, I should actually chip in there and say, in terms of, you read her poem, you can read it in your own time. She actually suffered quite a bit in England and fell out with his parents, David Livingstone's parents. And she was broke and things were not very good. But she did not bear a grudge. She bought into what he was doing. And she was fully supportive of what he was doing. And she never bad-mouthed him or told the children, your father, look, he's abandoned us. The way some wives do. She was fully on board, and that's one thing he appreciated about her. He felt he could have no better partner who understood the amount of time he needed to be away and why. Yeah. Yes, madam. Your thoughts as a woman.
Yeah, as a woman,
would you accept?
It's a tough one, but I think that to say that David Livingstone was wrong, it sounds like, when we think about it now, it sounds like the best answer. But I'll put in a scenario, and maybe an answer would help on the perspective. If, for example, my husband says he wants to enter into mission, okay? He wants to go, let's say,
Cairo.
Yeah, Iran or Afghanistan.
Okay.
It says he wants to go in Afghanistan, where we see every time on the news people being bombed and everything. Yes. So now, me as a fully supportive wife that I am,
right,
I say, okay, we are going. And then my mom comes and says, Sarah, like, the pressure that he got, right? And then she sits us down, starts telling us, you guys, if you go there, your children, they are going to die and everything. So now, let's say maybe I even buy in, I say, yeah, I think we are not going there. Will feel be wrong to still go for mission, which is our great commission, the command that God left for us to, like, this is the thing that we have to do. Would it be wrong for Phil to go to Afghanistan, leaving us behind? Well, maybe when I even agreed to say, okay, yeah, he needs to go, but for the sake of the children, we know that we can just stay in the house and they bomb us or something. So for the sake of the children, let us just remain here and you go. So now, in that case, in that scenario, okay, for the man who needs to do what is necessary, something that nobody is going to do, because, I mean, the things that David Livingstone did, in all the missionaries that we learned about in history, the people that we are still learning, nobody has ever done that. So are we going to really say that it was wrong?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think people are idealistic about ministry. When they try to make it look like you can do ministry and your family doesn't pay a price, I don't think it's true.
Yeah,
I think whatever level of ministry you are doing, your family will pay a price. Ministry is not, you don't clock in at 8 and clock out at 17. You know what I mean? Calls come anytime. You're discipling people, you're preaching, you're doing all these things. You are dealing with people. And to deal with other people, you have to be away from family. And for me, I've found that the family cannot run away from paying a price. Now, does that mean you abandon them completely and you're irresponsible? No. But I think it's a bit naive to say that you can be faithful in ministry and your family doesn't pay a price. I remember when I became a pastor, and every Saturday I was locked up preparing sermons. And I was thinking, so you mean I won't be spending Saturday with my family? And my wife and I had even arranged, so, twice a month we'll go visit relatives on Saturday. It's never happened because I'm locked up. And I remember thinking, wait a minute, I'm a son of a pastor. How was it growing up? And I could not remember a Saturday with my father. Couldn't. Unless we're on vacation, somewhere on leave, on holiday somewhere. My father at home on a Saturday. Never. I can't remember. And so at the end of the day, if you're going to faithfully fulfill your ministry, it's easy to say, no, I stop at 17 and I'm unavailable. But then your church won't grow. People won't be saved and so on. It requires time, it requires effort, it requires pouring into people to do ministry. So I think we have to bear that in mind. And in terms of opening up the interior of Africa, this had to be done. Someone had to go into these areas and look for how do we enter, you know what I mean? What can we do? Let's spread the gospel. Someone had to do it. And he was the man for the hour. I think, to be honest, he was faithful under the circumstances. And I think that's the key. That under the circumstances, you are faithful. He wrote letters, countless letters to his family. Countless. Everywhere he stopped, he was writing it. Writing. And look at how he discipled them in his letters. Some of us are at home with our kids. We can't disciple the way he discipled on the letters. Talked about Jesus. Told them, I'm here for Jesus. The reason why I'm not with you is for Jesus. Talking about respecting your mother, obeying your mother, avoiding sin. Look at how he discipled them when the wife died. He told them, guys, your mother has gone, but if you are in sin, you go to hell. Live for the Lord, submit yourself to the Lord, repent of your sins, and believe in Christ so that you can be reunited with your mother. So for me, full marks. Full marks for how, under the circumstances, he wrote. Even when he was not receiving communication, he kept writing to them. Kept writing to them. And I think I applaud him for that. Those are my thoughts. We can move on from this one. Any other? That's the authoritative position, huh? Any other comments, questions before we close? Yes.
Maybe I'll just take you back and the rest of the congregation back to the questions we were handling earlier in our different groups in connection to the way the story has ended. I think when you look at the difficulties he went through, the tenacity we talked about, the drive he had, I could see something of that, especially on his third journey, when there were no resources, and he had an opportunity actually to even walk back and get back to England. Yeah. But he kept refusing and refusing because over and above sharing the gospel to the villages where he was stopping, he had this preoccupation now to do something about the slave trade. Right. So I think it's all going back to those factory days, the 6 to 20 hours and 22 to midnight. Then midnight he wants to continue studying. The mother has to blow off the candle. Right. Like that drive, not to stop until he gets the work done. Right. And I think for me that's just something that has stood out, and it's just inspiring.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Right at the back. When it be children named David Livingstone. Daniel, are you tempted? Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, very good presentation. One thing that I'm seeing, or one of the things that I'm seeing, is when you look at how he blended science, exploration, faith, this is showing that serving God includes every aspect of our lives. Meaning that we can serve God in our profession as we're working, and can be working as an engineer, but even in that engineering you can serve God and glorify God in your life. And that's one of the things that I've picked from this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Why should he be studying? He's a missionary, right? And a doctor. Why should he be studying plants and recording things about the plants, about the rivers, about the land, insects? So this is a guy who just gave himself fully to Africa, and wanted to drink it all in and understand it all. And he just did as a passion. But then when he writes it all in his book, botanists are like, whoa, and zoologists are, whoa. And everybody's so impressed that he had that detail. Even studying the tribes, the languages, the customs, everything. He wanted to drink it all in. And it's that faithfulness to do our best and do the best we can. And not just work for pay, but work because, God has given us a mind and hands and heart and ears. And just throw ourselves completely in our work that God blesses, because then we're working diligently as unto him. Yes. Anybody else? Let's see the last few hands, if any. Okay, there. Any other hands? Any other hands? There. Any other hands? Oh, going once, twice. Okay. Ah, good. Any other hands? Any other hands? Going once, twice, thrice, twice. Okay. So we'll go Mr. Taguma, then the last three.
I think the level of sacrifice to me is mind-boggling. I don't know how many of us have, I've really been thinking as we have gone through this session, just the level at which David Livingstone really sacrificed. To me, it's something that I'm trying to find a way, to even measure it, because I can't really measure it. But it is very encouraging that we do have people, in our history who were able to make the kind of sacrifice that David Livingstone did. I mean, to land in this bush, with people who with very strange habits and lifestyles, and getting down to learn their ways, all for the sake of seeking to bring God's word. It's something that to me it's really imaginable, and I pray that at least we are able to learn something, about how we should relate to one another, and indeed relate to the world out there.
Good. Oza.
Okay, my question is on how he handled polygamous marriages. Would the approach be for someone who is saved and he's a polygamous, do they have to abandon their other families, or they continue living as a polygamous family?
Yeah, that's a good question, which missionaries have wrestled with. Do you send away some would, and there are so many answers. Some say pick one, the one you like the most, and then send the others away. Others would say, no, they pick the first one, and you have to get rid of the new ones. Others would say that you can still have multiple wives, but you just can't be an elder. He must be the husband of one wife. So it's okay, but forget about eldership and diaconate, you know. So people fall on different aspects over this matter. And there I have nothing authoritative for you. Yeah. Let each one be convinced in his own mind. That's what Paul says. Mainza.
Thank you, Pastor, for that teaching. Very informative and indeed challenging. My question is, towards the end of David Livingstone's life, I didn't hear much of his communication with his children. Is there anything, did they attend the burial? Of course, he was given national mourning and all, but what was the relation with his children, considering that their mom had already passed?
Yeah, good question. The children ended up scattered. One was in the army in America. I think it's his daughters, the two daughters who remained stationed in the UK. His boys were kind of spread around. I'm not sure how many of them were around for the funeral, but you see them very active. In terms of correspondence, he wrote a lot to Agnes, one of the daughters, and corresponded a lot with her. The problem in the last expedition was that he lacked paper, even just the paper to write on. That's how bad things were. And so it's very limited in that sense, in terms of the correspondence that he could write. And he suspected that all the letters he was giving the Arabs to send were not even going anywhere. So that hampered his ability to keep in touch with them. What is interesting is to see his grandchildren and great-grandchildren active. For example, his grandchild, like I mentioned, Herbert Wilson, was at the 1955 unveiling of a plaque for David Livingstone at Victoria Falls, just his grandchild. So one was even called David Livingstone, you know, the very names of his grandfather or great-grandfather. So there was certainly a continued commitment to his legacy by his children, and the government actually gave a one-off amount for his children, and also I think a stipend, a monthly amount to his children for their support. So those are the records that I was able to find pertaining to his relationship to them. By the way, Florence Nightingale, you know her, the nurse, wrote a letter to Agnes, his daughter, when he died, saying that we've lost a man we will never be able to replace. So that's how massive he was, that all these big names were even communicating with his family about him. Mrs. Konayuma has the last word. Make it good. Make it epic.
Thank you, Pastor. I'm happy about this presentation. When I look at the way David Livingstone is portrayed in schools, in history books in schools, well, they are spreading a different narrative from the man that they ought to talk about. Usually they present him just as an explorer, and of course he made great discoveries in Africa, yes. But the aspect of him being a missionary is just glossed over.
Right.
And so we don't get to hear about these great things that he did as a missionary. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Remember, he was accused of being more interested in exploration than missions. And even when he was making all these speeches at the height of his success, people were saying, you talk more about exploration than missions. And he said, I can't, make the reporters emphasize missions when I speak. They will emphasize whatever it is from what I say that they want to emphasize. So even in his own day, he was portrayed as a missionary, and that upset as an explorer, and that upset certain Christians. But it wasn't his fault. He spoke